Okay, so let's take a look at the subsection key conceptual frameworks and approaches in our introduction section of the DSM. So, as I was looking back over this material here, I realized a lot of things I was going to say in this video I've already covered in the video where I introduced the readings. Um, so, I'm going to try to be careful not to repeat myself. Okay. Saying that to myself as much as you guys. So I think the definition of mental disorder is it's really good to know their definition. They meaning the DSM authors. Um, you can see how that pairs or not pairs with our definition as social workers. I don't think it's necessarily a huge departure. We can certainly parse some of that out. I think what is important, and the one thing I wanted to, and I know I touched on this already, so I'll make this brief, but I think the thing I wanted to add to what they talk about, the authors, in this section about clinical utility, making sure that we're determining that what we're doing is helping to create treatment plans that are truly tailored to the individual and reflection of their identity, circumstances, etc. Um, and also, these diagnoses and the DSM can help us uh, think about prognosis and treatability and treatment outcomes and be able to have conversations about those kind of things with our clients. Um, Definitely a diagnosis of mental disorder is not equal to need for treatment. Uh, by the way, and the reverse is equally important and true, which is just because someone meets criteria for a diagnosis does not mean that they have to have treatment, and certainly does not necessarily mean that they need to have treatment that they're not willingly participating in. So, um, I think the other thing is that I wanted to call out is the part about disability, which is fine, I guess. Maybe it's more of an elaboration than necessarily it's a wrong term. But I like to think about these things of functioning, and of course, functioning in context. So, functioning can be something that's observable to others. Someone may think that they're functioning well and be getting feedback in their different roles in life, in their personal life, professional life, where they're not functioning as well as they think they are. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes they're not getting any feedback, and they feel like they're functioning terribly. And you say, well, are other people noticing that, or saying that they're noticing that to you? And they may not be, and it may be all very inside to them. But either way, it's equally important. And then also think about level of functioning in context and people in the context of people's social roles. Level of functioning for someone who is um, in their 80s and retired is different. Their expectations for themselves and the expectations, the reasonable expectations outside, are different than maybe someone who is much younger. Just as a one way to think about it. So making sure we're talking about functioning in context too, as well as perception, self-perception versus subjective observation. And then the last thing there, of which I did mention earlier, that I think in addition to clinical and public health and research purposes, the DSM can also be a tool of advocacy. It can be an advocacy to help get resources for someone, and it can be, there's lots of different contexts, but advocating for resources, advocating for in legal circumstances where you might be in a position to advocate for treatment versus punishment kind of situations. That's one of the areas where the DSM can be a tool of advocacy in your ability to not just come up with a diagnosis and a treatment plan and that kind of thing, but say, this is how I arrived here. I didn't just make this up on pure conjecture. I formulated this in a very methodical way. And so that's a big part of what we're doing here. The categorical and the dimensional approaches to diagnoses. Um, Again, I think it's, one thing I guess is about, oftentimes criteria are not fully met. We're going to work in lots, or you're going to work in lots, likely work in many different types of settings over the course of your social work career. In some of those settings, you may have lots of time with a client. One of the things I appreciate now working in private practice is I usually have not just a full session, but I may take multiple sessions to really make sure I'm properly getting to know a client, fully understanding their circumstances, what they're experiencing, making sure I'm processing what I'm observing, and to really do that well. Other times in my career where I worked in situations in emergency and crisis response situations in particular, where I have very, very little time to get to gather to get to know that individual and that client and try to understand what's happening with them and gather data. Um, so the also so the other thing about sort of from a philosophical standpoint is that this provides a guidance and a framework, meaning the criteria and this approach to formulating a diagnosis, but it's also not meant to be super rigid. um, you're going to accumulate experience as time goes on, and that is an important part of how you formulate all this data that you're going to encounter or have encountered or are encountering in your field placements. So your experience and building your experience and being conscious to your experience, things like this is why, although process recordings may seem tedious, they can have great value to you, because it's not just about what you're bringing in, what you're observing, what you're experiencing, but also how you're reacting to what you're experiencing, and being conscious about what comes up for you when you experience this stuff. It's all part of formulating your experience and your expertise over time, which is all to say that your own experience is an important part of this, and your own clinical judgment is an important part of this entire process. All right. So let's here with the cultural these things again. Sometimes you'll see these things laid out as more like terminologies. And I think these you can read and sort of, again, these can be useful exam questions, not because you have to memorize them, but just sort of recognize them. I think is a better way to put that. Um, and so as we move further down here, again, one of the things that's great about teaching this now and creating some new content for this course um, is that there's some of this stuff some of the content we're going through right now is really, this is the first time in any of the DSMs, or at least the ones I worked with, which is when I was a student in this program, it was DSM 3R, that they've brought in these considerations and put these definitions out as a reflection of here's why these things, the different levels of racism, the impact of uh, racism and discrimination and bias as a health risk, is really the first time, the first edition, meaning in the TR, that this stuff is really being brought in, or at least in the text and in a detailed way. So, and I think that from a definition standpoint, Mike says you guys are pretty familiar with these these as terminology in your social work. Um, so let's see. I think there's there are two cross-cutting committees specifically to look at some of these issues: culture, racism, discrimination, and how those have health impacts, and how that can and often, when it's evident that it will have an impact on a person's life and their clinical presentation. Um, and so then the last, the second to last section here is around the clarification on how the DSM uses sex and how it uses the term genders, and trying to make sure that those are being used in a thoughtful way, just to sort of trying to distinguish biology versus identity, and I think with the context that both of those are equally important. Uh, So you can read that, and here I mostly just pulled out what I thought were the most salient points from that subsection. And so you can evaluate that and reflect on it for yourself. How well or not that they have the DSM authors have pulled that in to how well that reflects our social work standpoint. So some of that is really sort of you should evaluate that for yourself.